capacity and disability benefits. We've seen a huge increase in caseload since COVID, about 1 million extra people on the caseload, about £20 billion of extra spending. And in the baseline forecast in March, even including the policy changes the government had announced at that time, spending was still forecast to increase by a further 15 billion. So still a big pressure from those benefits on the public finances. That forecast was based on an assumption, a judgment we had made, that some of the growth in the caseload we've seen since COVID is essentially been due to cost of living pressures, pushing people into the more generous benefits. And we made a judgment that once in our forecast cost of living pressures ease off, some of that caseload growth will also ease off. The 12 billion number in the report was the estimate of the risk if that judgment turns out to be wrong and actually caseload increases at the same rate we've seen since COVID, an extra £12 billion worth of spending. I think it's definitely worth saying that one of the reasons we highlighted that risk is because the drivers of this big increase in caseloads that we've seen is quite uncertain. It is probably a combination of changes in underlying health of the population, working age population deteriorating, a combination of sort of changes in the labour market, cost of living pressures, but also structural factors in the benefit system itself.
But do you identify? Sorry, can I just add on that specific point? Do you identify challenges derived from the different pathway for mental health, for example, as a specific particular challenge in terms of the volume and cost of the welfare of?
Well, so it's difficult to isolate the specific cost of that driver, but we've certainly highlighted it in some of the analysis we've done as one of the most important drivers of the additional caseload, increasing mental health issues, especially amongst younger people.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glynn. Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Chair. I have to say, when I read your fiscal risks and sustainability report this time, I immediately thought of that Hemingway quote about how did you go bankrupt? 2 ways, first gradually and then suddenly. And I thought that the report really looked like we had entered the suddenly phase. And so I wanted to ask you about one of the things that you scored in your 2024 report, which appears to be sort of suddenly changing. And that is the very high risk you allocated to scoring the change to the taxation of non-domiciled residents in the UK. And you put it in the category of there's really, really high uncertainty around this about the behavioural changes. You scored specifically for the change to charging inheritance tax on worldwide assets as being about 0.1 in terms of revenue over the next few years. It does seem to be one of those things, according to media reports, that is suddenly changing behaviour. And does the Office for Budget Responsibility have any way of pulling a ripcord and saying, help, we think we got this one wrong, our central assumption's clearly not right, this is going to cost the Treasury a lot more than we thought, please do something, Mr. Josephs?
Thank you. So, well, as you say, you're absolutely right. We've highlighted that this is a very uncertain costing. It affects a relatively small group of taxpayers and ones which are likely to have large behavioural response to tax changes. We will not be updating the costing of that until the next fiscal event, and I think it is the case at the moment that there is no real hard evidence on the impact that it is having, and it's quite likely there won't be any hard evidence for quite some time until we actually get firm outturn data on from HMRC. In the reforms that the previous government made in their final fiscal event, we assumed that there would be a migration response to the non-DOMS regime changes of around 10 to 20%. So, i.e. 10 to 20% of non-DOMs would leave the country as a result of those reforms. We then changed that assumption in October on the basis of the changes that the current government made, in particular in respect of inheritance tax. We increased it to sort of 12 to 25% of non-DOMs leaving as a result of the reforms. So yeah, quite a substantial migration assumption is already assumed in the costing. The 25% number essentially refers to the very highest wealth individuals, ones who have trusts. The 12% refers to those without trusts. So a pretty big assumption, a pretty big migration assumption is already baked into that costing. As I say, I don't think we will really have any hard evidence on the actual outcome for quite some time.
They could all have left by the time you get the actual numbers, is really what I'm hearing you say.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that we won't have any hard data on the actual numbers that have left until we get the tax returns. I mean, even at that point, it's probably going to be quite difficult to isolate the impacts of this specific policy change against lots of other factors that affect location decisions from this group, who are obviously a very highly mobile group of individuals.
And what comparators would you use though for a normal year where non-DOMs, because they're highly mobile people with assets all over the world potentially, or in the high extreme, compared with, can you isolate the impacts of
well, I think we will try very hard and work with HMRC to try and isolate the impact of these policies. But I say there is a lot of turnover in this population anyway, so it will be likely quite difficult. I mean, we based those migration assumptions on the behaviour we saw in the previous set of reforms in 2017. When actually the response was less large than quite a lot of people were expecting.
In terms of what you scored for, anecdotally, the inheritance tax changes, which seem to be having the biggest impact in terms of people's location decisions, was 0.1 every year in terms of the net. So it's not a huge revenue inbound, but you've not got any way that you can sort of pull the emergency cord and warn the Treasury about potentially these assumptions.
Well, that's not tested. So we do our costings updates at fiscal events, and at that point we'll assess whatever evidence there is then.
Thank you very much, Dame Harriet. Dr. Jeevan-Sander, MP.
Thank you very much. I had a very quick question, if I may, Mr. Hughes, about the climate risks you point to. Can I also just commend the OBR on the work on this, because it's been incredibly useful in the debate, as well as setting out the investments and the costs. From where I'm sitting, it looks like we're having a lot of damage going forward that are accounted for in the cost of transition, which are accounted for. But the productivity benefits of the transition, investment in skills, clean energy, reducing the marginal price, more capital per worker, all of those benefits don't seem to be included in the productivity estimates of future growth. Is that a fair reading of where it is at the moment?
Tom might want to say more, but I can have a first go, which is, I mean, when we look at the cost of net zero transition, the cost of climate damage, generally speaking, the cost of climate damage seems to be going up. Net zero seems to be getting cheaper for a whole host of reasons relative to our previous estimates. In terms of whether you could make the net zero transition even cheaper by getting some sort of economic productivity dividend, we don't assume that in the way in which we do our projections. For a number of reasons, partly no serious climate economist can give us a number, and we're definitely not climate economists in the OBR, and so we rely an awful lot on empirical estimates that come from the literature, in particular people who can do it for the UK economy, not for some other economy with a different configuration of energy supply and other things. The second thing is, if you think back, we are more or less leading the charge in carbon reductions in the UK and have been for decades, and our productivity has been going down. So there isn't an obvious correlation in recent history between making the transition to net zero and boosting productivity. Now, I'm not saying one is the cause of the other. I'm not saying that. But what you haven't seen is being ahead of other countries in the net zero transition, putting us ahead of other countries in terms of in the sort of great race to make our economies productive again. So that relationship doesn't emerge obviously from the data. We've asked other experts around who are much more expert in climate economics than us, if there were a fair number to put into our forecasts or even into some scenarios, what would that number be? And I should say there are people on either side of that debate, right? There are people who say the net zero transition is going to be good for productivity because it's going to make the unit cost of energy lower. There are other people on the other side of the argument who say it's going to make the economy less productive because you're just basically, for a period of time, raising the unit cost of energy that you currently use because it's still mostly from fossil fuels. And that's going to hurt energy intensive businesses. It's going to squeeze margins in any business who's got to keep the lights on. And that's going to have an adverse effect on their investment and other things. In the end, we've ended up in a sort of unsatisfactory neutral position of saying we don't know which side of this debate is going to turn out to be right. But for the moment, nobody's made a persuasive case one way or the other, and there's not much in history that can give you a positive correlation between reducing your emissions and boosting your productivity.
Isn't this part of the worry, though? I guess a wider point about non-quantifiable benefits. Like, I think in the post-war period, there was huge investment that led to huge productivity gains at that moment. But if at that point we had the OBR, it'd be very difficult to see we could have invested in anything because people would have said, well, there's not going to be a benefit. But to the point about energy costs, I just want to have one slight clarification point, if I may. I'm a little bit confused when you say it won't improve productivity. So at the moment, you're right, we've built out on clean energy the one side, but on the other side we've still got a lot of natural gas, which is therefore always setting the marginal price. And the reason why we have such high industrial energy prices is precisely because the natural gas is setting the marginal price. So I suppose if we accept the fact that if you get off natural gas for some of your marginal pricing, you're going to have lower energy bills, wouldn't that lead to a productivity improvement?
I mean, it depends. Part of it depends on how much you need to pay for storage, because the problem with wind and solar is it's intermittent. So how much are you paying for storage, and what does that do to the unit cost? If you're getting your base load from nuclear, we know nuclear is very expensive and can drive up the unit cost of energy system wide. So, and then in other areas like heating, you can move your gas boiler to a heat pump. That heats your house in a less dirty way, but it doesn't do any better. It just keeps your house warm. So it's not obvious that you're getting some kind of disposable income benefit from that transition either. And people are spending a lot of money to switch from one to the other. So that's why we've ended up in a sort of, on this particular question, that's why we ended up on sort of neutral position. I mean, it's not correct to characterize us as saying we don't believe in the growth effects of public investment. We do believe in the growth effects of public investment, and that's exactly, as we discussed earlier, reflected in our forecasts.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sender.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, another place where we're going to suddenly start losing revenues is fuel duty. So I just wanted to clarify, in the current numbers that you have, the projection that you have, the temporary 5p reduction in fuel duty ends when?
I believe that ends next spring.
I believe it does, yes. And where is the inflection point where it's just going to have such a major impact that we no longer have as many petrol cars on the roads, that chancellors are going to have to step in and do something? Mr. Josephs.
Well, so as you've mentioned, in our analysis of the long-term costs of the transition to net zero for government, fuel duty is the loss of fuel duty is essentially the biggest loss, amounts to around 2/3 of the total cost.
Clearly a chancellor is going to have to do something.
We have a scenario in the report actually which looks at how you could reduce the cost of that transition if you were to both sort of choose a policy path, and the decision on policy path is obviously up to government, but to illustrate the risk, a policy path where governments spend less on the transition, choose to use other tools such as regulation or taxation, and replace fuel duty with potentially another motoring tax, almost halves the cost in terms of the impact on debt of the transition to net zero in our scenarios. It is also the case, even over the medium-term forecast, that you can start to see the impact of the loss of revenue from electric vehicles. So even with the assumption that we have to have in our forecast that fuel duty rises in line with RPI, by the end of the forecast, fuel duty starts to fall as a share of GDP because of the increased electrification.
So what year is that, just for
I think from memory it's right at the end of the current forecast.
What year
it's
is
like
that?
29, 30.
30.
Yeah.
But all other things being equal, if the Chancellor doesn't make a decision in this year's fiscal event, fuel duty will go up 5 pence next spring.
That is the assumption in the forecast, yeah.
There is a very small unit in the Treasury that's looking at some of these green taxes. Do you have any engagement with them? I mean, it's quite a small number of people.
So do we have any engagement, did you say, with the unit in the Treasury?
Yeah, because we talked, I mean, you obviously only discuss actual government policy, but there is a team in the Treasury looking at this issue of what is a green tax and how do you deal with the fuel duty issue.
Well,
So
I think
I
think we sort of on principle don't discuss our engagement with Treasury on policy issues ahead of fiscal.
Okay, well, we'll come. Good try. Yeah, John Grady MP.
Yeah, so Mr. Josephs, imagine you've come with me to meet a bunch of kind of late 20s, early 30s people in my constituency to talk about pensions. And they're all telling you that you've got the state pension, they're putting a bit into their pension. The self-employed couple in the corner aren't. Could you talk us through what you see as the main problems with our current pension system from a point of view of sustainability of public finances and also securing that group of 20 and 30-year-olds have a comfortable retirement?
Sure. So, well, the risks that we highlight in terms of long-term sustainability from the pension system are driven by 3 things. So we look at state pensions where the demographic trends and the ageing population mean that on the basis of current policy, state pension spending would increase over time by about a percentage and a half of GDP, which is the kind of second biggest source of upward pressure on spending over the long term after healthcare. We also look at the risks to that around the triple lock and show that basically the triple lock is not only a sort of source of pressure, it's a source of risk. And if we have a scenario similar to the one we've seen since 2010, where we've had much more volatile inflation than we had previously and lower earnings, and project that out, then the triple lock adds on top of the sort of baseline projection around another percentage and a half of GDP pressure on the public finances. So that, is a substantial pressure on the public finances over that time frame. The second risk we look at goes to a point on kind of self-employed. The transition from DB to DC pensions and auto-enrollment has meant that a lot more people than previously are now saving for a private pension. Sorry, I've now moved from state pension to private pension, so a lot more people are saving for private pension. But there is quite a lot of evidence, and here we drew on studies by the IFS and DWP and others, that quite a number of groups look like they might not be saving enough to give them an adequate pension in retirement. And there are some particular groups, self-employed is one, that are not taking up private pensions to the same degree as others. That's not necessarily a direct risk to the public finances, but it does create some risk that in the future the government might have to provide more support to those sort of groups when they reach retirement. And then the final risk we highlight is the one we talked earlier around the decline of the DB sector.
And just on because with the decline in DB, people move to DC, they bear the investment risk.
Yeah.
You've identified one factor which drives up the non-pension benefits bill for pensioners in your report is housing benefit for pensioners because home ownership's dropped. Yeah. But presumably that's another risk, isn't it, with the switch from DB to DC, if people aren't saving enough, that actually there's additional pressure on the government budget so that people have, a reasonable minimum living standard.
Yeah, no, so you're right. So that's another group that we highlight in the report, again, drawing on the IFS analysis that shows that people in private rented accommodation are projected to have less adequate retirement incomes than other groups, and that could create pressure on the housing benefit bill for future governments, or also just pressure to provide wider support in the future.
And in 2070, you show 7.7% or so on for pension, 1.3% on pensioner benefits, e.g. housing benefits. That gets you to 9% or so of GDP being spent on pensions and pensioner benefits. Is that sustainable?
Well, I mean, the picture we are presenting overall when we do our long-term projections is one of debt on an unsustainable path. And the main contributors to that are the fact that there are a number of elements of spending that, on the basis of the current policy settings and demographic assumptions, put upward pressure on spending, while tax as a share of GDP is projected to be broadly stable or slightly falling because of the loss of fuel duty. So it's the combination of pressures on spending from a number of sources, of which pensions is a big one, that creates this gap.
And this combination, how material is the pensions element?
I say, after health care, it's the second biggest contributor to the increase in spending over our long-term projections.
And I suspect you're going to politely decline the offer to set out some options that the government could look at to make this more sustainable.
So again, we're not here to comment on policy, but we do provide different scenarios in the report around the impact of the different factors that contribute to this increase. So demographics is one, the triple lock is obviously one. We also look at the impact that the state changes to the state pension age have, so increases to the state pension age. Over the long term, that actually makes quite a considerable difference in terms of reducing the pressure from state pension spending over time. It lowers it by about 1% of GDP in total, so we assume 3 increases in the state pension age over that 50-year projection.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grady. Certainly a very important long-term issue. We're now bringing to a conclusion this part of our hearing today. So order.